Welcome to From the Editor's Desk, a podcast where I visit with Kyle Brasseur, the editor-in-chief at Compliance Week, to take a look at top stories from March, what Compliance Week is working on for April, and save the world through a discussion of sports. I know you'll enjoy this episode of From the Editor's Desk. Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox. Welcome to From the Editor's Desk, a podcast where we unpack some of the top stories which either have or will appear in Compliance Week, look at some compliance stories, talk some sports, and generally try to solve the world's problems. I'm your co-host, Tom Fox.
And I'm Kyle Brasseur, editor-in-chief at Compliance Week. I'm once again thrilled to be joining Tom. We're going to talk some top compliance stories. We're going to be looking at some of the stuff that's on our radar. And as always, we'll be breaking down some sports.
Well, Kyle, I hate to say any time is more or less interesting or dynamic or dramatic for compliance professionals. But I will say Q1 2023 and March 2023 were as dynamic at times as I've seen recently, particularly when you consider no enforcement action. So I have to believe you wrote about some of the things that were said and these issued, but where did you guys see all of these going for compliance? Because I know you covered them extensively.
Yeah, and like you said, Tom, this has been just a significant month from a compliance perspective. And it's crazy that with everything that's going on at the Department of Justice right now, that's not really been the focal point, just because everything that's going on with the U.S. financial system and everything that's happened in the wake of the collapse of Silicon Valley Bank. For us at Compliance Week, that's been a really big story. It's as the vice chair for supervision at the Fed is going to testify, the collapse of Silicon Valley Bank is a textbook case of risk mismanagement. And so for us, there's a lot of risk stories that we've been really gleaning out of the topic. So that's where a lot of our focus has been. But like I said, lost in the shuffle, but equally important, has been a lot of those policy changes at the DOJ. And I thought it was really a speech that Kenneth Polite delivered in the latter half of March, where he was talking about the changes. And he really wanted to take a moment to linger and to say, hey, just because all of this new is going on doesn't mean any of the old is no longer a factor here. That's the thing I think is lost in the shuffle, is so much news going on, but all the old is still in place. And so there's a lot for compliance officers to really be mindful of at the start of this year. I think last year, in our assessment, a really key theme was basically the idea of liability around the chief compliance officer role. And we felt like that got a lot of attention. But it seems like 3 months into 2023, that's not going anywhere anytime soon. The DOJ is really seeking to empower chief compliance officers, but on the other end of that means more pressure on the chief compliance officer to deliver in their role because the scrutiny is going to be in.
That's a great point about the old hadn't gone away. One of the best phrases I heard was from a colleague who said, now is the time to reprioritize your compliance program. And I said, because of the new stuff? He goes, no, because of everything you have to do anyway. Just reprioritize everything you've been doing. And I thought about it a while. I thought that's as good as advice as I have, because you're absolutely right. Yes, there was communications about instant messaging. Yes, there was communications about clawbacks. Yes, there was communications about financial incentives. But I went through the 2023 ECCP, and that was 10%, 5% maybe. And you're absolutely right. What about that other 95% that none of us have talked about yet? It's still there. So that's really a great point. On the financial regulatory side, I know you guys have obviously written about the failures, but where do you see rather, the SEC taking an interest in this as opposed to or in conjunction with some of the banking regulators?
Yeah, I think the SEC's role is to really, look at the executives, the actions of the executives, because that's a spot where banking regulators have historically been weak. The Dodd-Frank Act doesn't have the strongest regulations to really crack down on the actions of the individuals. And this is something that President Biden has highlighted and said he's looking for Congress to step up and be able to put forward regulations under the Dodd-Frank Act that would allow the banking regulators to seek clawbacks. Again, there's that word. But I think the SEC, from where things are being reported at this point in time, they're paying close attention to the stock trading actions of these executives at these banks. There's been some sort of questionable timing on some of those transactions. So I imagine that's where their focus is on at this point. But a lot of this stuff's still evolving at this time. At this point, it's really kind of damage control to make sure that the rest of the financial system stays afloat. And I think what we're going to be seeing in the month ahead is the regulators picking up the pieces. I know for our purposes, we're very anxiously awaiting the report that Vice Chair for Supervision, Michael Barr, is going to be releasing from the Fed on May 1st, I do believe is the day that they've committed to it being released publicly, on the oversight failures where supervision could have been enhanced to prevent what happened at Silicon Valley. So once the regulators really start to figure out their role in this is when I think a lot of those pieces are going to fall into place. But for now, I imagine the SEC is really focused on the individuals here. And that kind of fits in line with the way the regulatory picture really is shaping up at this point in time, is let's try to enhance our ability to hold individuals accountable for their actions to reduce the burden on the companies and their shareholders.
Kyle, one of the things that has intrigued me about the SVP Bank failure is that for approximately 8 months, the company did not have a chief risk officer. And what, if any, did that lack of a chief risk officer play? The Wall Street Journal had an article on that this weekend, and they talked about that as one of the loneliest positions in a bank. Do you see a chief risk officer as equating to a chief compliance officer and its importance to a financial institution as opposed to perhaps a public company? And how have you guys looked at that issue?
Yeah, I would never say anyone's more important than the chief compliance officer. I know my audience, Tom. No, I think that it's a position that's right up there with equal importance. I think the evidence of this, and this is actually something I wrote in the aftermath of the SVB collapse, is in some of the actions of banks. Barclays and Danske Bank last year each promoted their chief risk officers to their CEOs. And so that gives you all the proof that you need for the importance of this position. It's really the person who knows the ins and outs of the bank maybe better than anybody. So there's just a real emphasis on that role. And what I wrote in my column was, we don't know for sure what happened, but it sure is glaring that this position was not filled for 8 months. They mentioned that they had their risk committee sort of holding the role. It's not like nobody was doing it, but to not have an individual whose sole responsibility was that, you have to imagine it played a role in this. Was clear red flags that were most likely missed along the way. And you imagine if someone's job was to look for those red flags, they would have caught them. It's really hard to understate the value of that position at these financial institutions, especially these larger ones, because the risks are just innumerable. So it's a shame to see that. And the way I wrote it is I really feel for the woman who took over as chief risk officer in January, because there's always going to be that sort of finger pointing and being able to say, oh, the chief risk officer should have caught. What chance did she have? Amelia was about in the role for maybe a month and a half, and was probably picking up the pieces from the 8-month vacancy.
Let me turn to April, our next upcoming month. Could you tease us perhaps with some of the stories you're either looking to report, any longer reports that you're working on, or what might be coming out from Compliance Weekend?
Yeah, so we'll be continuing some of the fallout from the Silicon Valley Bank thing. Like I said, this story is not really going anywhere anytime soon. So I know we have a lot of resources tied up in continuing to report on that. But one of the other things that we're really excited about being able to produce, most likely coming in early May, is we do have our next case study currently in the works. If you're not familiar with Compliance Week case studies, we've done one a year for each of the last 3 years. They're really in-depth dives into the way a company is approaching a certain compliance topic. So previous examples being the Volkswagen Dieselgate scandal and their culture rebuild in the aftermath of their emissions cheating scandal. And then we did one last year on ransomware attacks, and it didn't focus on a company directly. We created a fictional company, but we put it through the paces of a ransomware attack based on the real life examples that happened to companies like Colonial Pipeline and JBS. These are really pieces of premium content that we take a lot of pride in. So our next case study is currently coming together. It's still in the writing phase, so we haven't officially announced the subject and everything like that, but I can tease the topic a little bit. We're going to be really taking a deep dive into ESG and how it's handled from the top of the business all the way through to suppliers. So basically starting from the CEO and setting the tone, to senior managers from there, to the employees, and then throughout the entire supply chain. What does it take to get everyone on the same page with such a topic that's getting a lot of interest, getting a lot of scrutiny from investors nowadays, and getting a lot of scrutiny from regulators under the Biden administration? We did a piece last year that kind of scratched the surface a little bit with working with FedEx and their chief compliance officer and chief sustainability officer on their ESG disclosures. So we're really excited to be able to take a deeper dive with another company and really get into the weeds of how these sort of things can work, because we do see it as a topic that gets a lot of interest among the compliance community, a lot of people who are confronting ESG for the first time.
So let's maybe turn to the upcoming 2023 Compliance Week conference, because I know a lot of us are pointing towards that. And we've talked about that in prior episodes, but I was wondering if there are any more speakers you've been able to confirm, particularly keynotes or any key government officials that you are either in talks with or you've been able to confirm, or how is that event progressing?
Yeah, it's shaping up to be really exciting. And we still have some invitations out to a few government folks. There's, I think, going to be some opportunities for someone to come in at the last minute to really take the agenda up to the next level. I think one of the things I'm secretly crossing my fingers for is that the SEC will finally propose or put their final rule out for the climate related disclosures. And then someone from the SEC will grace us with their presence and really be able to get into that. If timing works out, that would be quite nice. But we are really excited about the speakers that we do have lined up. We do have a keynote confirmed from Glenn Leon, who is the new head of the fraud section at the DOJ. He actually spoke at our conference last year when he was still CICO at Hewlett Packard Enterprise. So nice to see what a year's difference it makes for him in his speaking role at Compliance Week. And we do have Matt Galvin from the DOJ as well, who will be speaking as part of a panel on data analytics. He's a new hire there at Justice. But from the government side, we still have some invitations out there. And then from the practitioner side, I think there's really a lot to be excited for. And I wrote a piece this month when we were 10 weeks out from the conference labeling the 10 things I'm looking most forward to. And I think there's really going to be some great panels with some great practitioner voices on them. That for me is the main thing I'm always looking for at a conference is I want to hear from someone who's in the role, just being able to say, here's how I do it. You can take it or leave it or whatever it might. That's always my favorite part of these conferences is just the idea of being able to just learn from someone who's doing the same job as you. It's going to be really exciting to be able to have those in addition to those regulator voices and maybe that opportunity for a little extra guidance that everyone's asking for.
So for those who have not listened to this podcast before, the real excuse for doing this podcast is just to talk sports.
Naturally.
And I started with Kyle's predecessor, but it's been equally or more fun with Kyle. So as always, we've got some great sports stories. And I have to start with the aptly named March Madness because it truly was madness this year. There's never been a year like this. I think I saw there was a 9-5-5-4. That's the Final Four this year. Half the number ones were gone the first weekend. The other half got knocked out on Thursday or Friday. It was as competitive a basketball as I've seen. 16 beat a 1. God bless Fairleigh Dickinson. God bless Princeton. And it was great to see those schools. But I guess, Kyle, I wanted to use that not to maybe focus on the teams. Any thoughts on what led to this most competitive tournament? I had some friends bitching about the seeding. It was committee's fault. I had some people about the transfer portals. I've had others just say one and done versus 4 years. Probably all of the above, or maybe none of the above. But what are your thoughts?
For starters, I'm glad you didn't ask me how my bracket's doing because that's that's a dangerous question to ask someone nowadays. Yeah, I think there's always in the moment, everyone points their finger to something. So this is the fault of this or this is the fault of that. But at the end of the day, any changes to the transfer portal or anything like that, they don't really have an impact on what's going on the court and during these games. And it's really a testament to the way some of these smaller schools and these lower seeds have shown up and really seized this opportunity to really say, all right, we're in this thing. We have as much a shot as anyone else does. And that's the way these things happen sometimes, is sometimes David does beat Goliath. But I think one of the crazy things this year is how often David is handing it to Goliath. And that's what really is awe-inspiring is every now and then you have one of these shocking upsets. But this year it has just been an onslaught of upsets. And I think it's exciting. I think it's great for the sport. I know my friends and those who are watching it are more tuned in really than ever because it's just been crazy and unpredictable. And that said, you want your bigger schools in the Final Four because that they have the bigger fan base if you're the NCAA. But I think this is a good thing overall. I think parity is really great, and it's a good opportunity for some people to really shine and say, hey, we put in the work just as much as everyone else did this year. And just because we're not a number one seed doesn't mean we don't deserve to be here. I think, yeah, you can certainly point the finger at new stuff or anything like that. But at the end of the day, every single one of these teams that have taken the court have had every chance to win. And if they didn't win, then it's on the players and the coaches.
Another basketball story, but perhaps not as much fun, and that's Ja Morant. He got into trouble because in a video he was shown at a gentleman's club or other establishment where alcohol was served with a gun in the state of Colorado, which is illegal in the state to take a gun into where alcohol's. Even though I live in the great state of Texas, I'm the opinion that anytime you have a gun inside or outside your pants and you're not a serving police officer, it's not a good thing. At first, I was extraordinarily irritated that he did this. I have very bad feelings about young men and alcohol. But the more I thought about it, Kyle, I thought about he something's bothering him. I don't want to say something's, but there's clearly some problem. And whether he's a 100 millionaire at 23, whether he's carrying the weight of the Memphis team on his shoulders, whatever it might be, I think he needs some serious help. And the last time typically we don't have guns in the NBA, but the last time we had this issue, Gilbert Arenas took a gun into a Washington Wizards locker room and he was suspended for a season or half a season for that. So it's a serious issue, but I also have some sympathy for Ja Morant himself. Where do you see this, or how would you look at this if you were still reporting it?
Yeah, I think it's always a tough story to report because you do want to be sensitive to just everyone that's involved in it. These things are not easy, and it's always important to remember that these athletes are also humans. And I think you may have said it best. You said, yeah, there's a pattern here, and it really seems more like it's someone that's crying for help in some way, shape, or form. Ja is an incredibly talented basketball player who's really has the whole world on a plate to some extent. But the fact that he's doing these things it should raise alarm, and it should raise alarm not only for the other people who are at risk, but also for the person himself who's feeling as if he needs to do this or whatever it might be. So, when you're covering a story like this, it's very difficult. And I remember when I was reporting on baseball, thankfully we never really got too in the weeds on it from a Red Sox perspective, but big story at the time, and I'm sure you're quite familiar with this as a Texan, was the personal life of Josh Hamilton. And he was another player who was just blessed with all the talent in the world, who went through a lot of personal hardship and a lot of demons and battles that he had. And it played out on a very public stage because of his talents. And it's hard, I think, to really feel that pressure and to know that everyone knows what you're going through. We all have our private lives that we keep guarded and whatnot. And so these players just don't get that opportunity to really have that. It's difficult. I think as a reporter, you want to be sensitive to it. You want to just keep the news as the news. I never thought columns were classy in this type of time. I don't really need to give my opinion on what's going on here. I think it's just someone needs help. And I'm glad to see that Jaws is seeking that help. I'm glad to see that he's confronted it, he's acknowledged it, and he said, yeah, I wasn't in the right place, and I'm taking the steps to get back on track, because this is a kid with all the talent in the world and really could really be a face of a franchise and a face of the league. I think that they're going to do everything they possibly can to get him back on track into that position, and I hope it works out for him. I think he's an absolute pleasure to watch, and at the end of the day, that's what these athletes are supposed to do. It's just supposed to be entertainers, and it's hard that they're cast into other lights beyond the entertainment factor.
Kyle, our next story is the World Baseball Classic. And I hope our listeners who love baseball got to watch some of this, because it was certainly some of the most exciting baseball, other than the Astros winning the World Series, that I've seen in quite some time. As you would expect, the teams from Latin America play with a verve that we typically don't see here in Major League Baseball, although you do see individual players. The Japanese just bring honor to everything they do. But we had teams from England, we had Israel, we had the Netherlands all play some really great games, and some individual players just shone through. But I absolutely love this year, except for, of course, Jose Altuve having his thumb broken, and we're going to miss him for 2 months here in Houston. But what were your assessment of the World Baseball Classic? Is it here to
Tom, I love the World Baseball Classic. I'm a huge WBC fan, so I'm glad you bring it up. The hat that I wear to baseball games when I go is a Team USA hat. I think it's just such a cool concept. I love to see the other countries and how excited that they get to be taking part in it. I think we take for granted here baseball as America's pastime and whatnot, and it's just treated a little bit more like a business and as a sport, and people conduct themselves a certain way on the field. So I love to see the way other countries approach the game. And I think it's so diversified. I think it's such a good platform for the sport to be able to show that it's the same game, but it's played in a completely different way and with a completely different level of emotion. So I certainly hope it's not going anywhere. I don't think it's going anywhere anytime soon. I think it's a big boon for Major League Baseball and for the baseball community as a whole. And it really puts the sport on a good global platform. And I know a popular point is it's too early in the year for these players to be playing all out in a competitive environment, and there's a heightened risk of injury. But there's a risk of injury everywhere. Reese Hoskins from the Philadelphia Phillies just is pretty much out for the year on an injury and on a routine grounder in spring training. So these things can happen anywhere at any time. And I certainly have reported my fair share of players going on the disabled list because they sneezed. It truly it can happen anywhere. So I don't really buy into that complaint about the World Baseball Classic. I think it's a ton of fun. I think it's great that the games are all on at different times. So in the past, now I'm getting older and I don't quite have the energy to do it, but I would get up at 6 a.m. and watch those games and stay up till 2 a.m. and watch those games. I just think it's such a cool concept. And I certainly, as a person, I hope it doesn't go anywhere. But I also think, just as an observer, that it'd be really foolish for MLB to not continue to see it through. It's just such a pleasure, I think, every time of year, especially in a slower time for the sports season. Football is really just recently finished. Basketball and hockey are closing out their regular seasons. It's a really cool thing to be able to throw in there right before March Madness really gets zany.
Could anyone have written a better scripted ending for the final pitcher and the final batter of the final out of the final game in the World Baseball Classic than Shoshana Ohtani versus Mike Trout? Teammates, two of the very best players at their positions, two of the people I watch when they're on television, mano a mano.
Yeah, and at this point in time, that is only possible in the World Baseball Classic. So why would you take that away?
Kyle, that's as good a note to end this particular podcast on. So I hope our listeners enjoyed us. I hope you will join us again. I'm Tom Fox.
And I'm Kyle Brasseur. Thanks again for having me, Tom. Always a pleasure.
This is Tom Fox again. Thanks so much for listening to this episode of From the Editor's Desk. I hope you will subscribe, rate, and review this podcast as it would help in our rankings. From the Editor's Desk is a production of the award-winning Compliance Podcast Network.